Jordan Peterson sat down with Steven Bartlett on his Diary of a CEO podcast, and there were two key moments that you're going to want to see. In this first clip, Peterson calls out every single one of us. Is there something that you need to say that you're not saying, or something that you're being called to do that you aren't doing? You're going to want to watch this. And finally, Bartlett pressed Peterson hard to clarify his belief in God and whether or not he really thinks Jesus is God, and whether or not Christianity is true. The way that he answers this, I think, is important for every Christian, yes, but anyone considering whether or not Christianity is true. Here we go.
I spent a lot of time studying evil, a lot of time. And I know how it arises. It arises when good men hold their tongue. You don't want that. There's nothing worse that can happen to you. Now, you may suffer some consequences of speaking, for sure. But all things considered, which is the right attitude if you're wise, there's nothing worse that can happen to you than to falsify your speech.
Is saying nothing a form of falsifying your speech?
It is when you have something to say. Yeah, definitely.
Because there's a lot of people probably listening now that have a lot they want to say,
Yeah.
but if they say it, they're going to lose their job, or there's going to be immediate consequences, which might mean they can't feed their family.
Yeah, it might mean that, but it also might mean that if they bite their tongue and pretend to be something other than they are, they'll be a weak model for their children. And, is that better than having some financial instability? Maybe, here's a counter proposition. If your job requires you to lie, maybe you should find another job.
Mm-hmm.
Now, look, I also understand that there are strategic considerations in such a decision. There's no sense martyring yourself stupidly. And if you're going to say what you believe to be the case, then you need to put yourself in a position where doing so won't be instantly catastrophic in a way you can't fix. Because that's not wise. Now, when things blew up around me, I had 3 sources of income. That wasn't accidental. Now, people say, well, you were fortunate. It's like, yeah, and careful.
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't want to have all my eggs in one basket. And that turned out, well, I knew that. It's like, you have no autonomy if you have all your eggs in one basket. So if you're going to think strategically, if you're going to think like someone who's at war, let's say, then you don't leave a mortal flank exposed. And so if, here's a rule, if you find yourself in a position where you're unable to speak, you haven't fortified your territory properly. Right, so then you have to think about that. It's like you think, okay, why can't I say what I believe to be the case? Where am I vulnerable? And you can say, well, that's inevitable. It's like, no, it's not. It's not inevitable. That doesn't mean it isn't difficult to fortify and to put yourself in a position where you're on the offense successfully. That's hard. But retreating one step at a time defensively for your whole life and shrinking while you do it, that's also difficult. It's just the kind of difficult that wears you down and makes you sick of yourself. That's not a good plan. That's a bad plan.
Evil arises when good men hold their tongue. I want to add to this. Evil arises when good men hold their tongue and do nothing. How long are you going to put off standing up for the truth and doing the work that God is calling you to? The world falls short. Evil wins in the measure that each and every one of us fail to speak the truth, stand for the faith, and compromise on the work that God made us for. Maybe you are compromising because you don't think it's true. You think your religious belief is in a box over here, separate from the rest of your life. Maybe you've been fooled or influenced by modern secular atheist thinkers and philosophies. Here's Peterson dismantling just about every single one of those that have led so many astray and effectively explaining why Christianity is the truth. This is really good. Check this out.
Postmodernists figured out that we live in a story, but then they leapt to a faulty conclusion of 2 forms. Well, 3. There's no uniting story. That was one of their conclusions. In fact, the definition of postmodernism is skepticism of meta-narratives. There's no uniting story. It's like, well, that's a stupid theory because there's no union. So what? There's just diversity. Well, we worship diversity now in this utterly foolish manner. There's no difference between diversity and war. Without a uniting narrative, there's nothing but war. So, no, that's not going to work. Wrong. Hedonistic self-gratification. There's Michel Foucault for you to a T. It's like, why is that wrong? Why can't people just do what they want with whoever they want all the time? Because it defeats itself and quickly. It's not a sustainable game. If it's all about you and your whims, I don't want to be anywhere near you. And that won't be so good for you. That's not going to work. Power. That's really where the postmodernists landed with their, what would you say, temptation to turn towards Marx. It's all about power. It's like, first of all, that's probably a confession, if that's what you believe. And second, no, it's not. Try tyrannizing your wife and see how well that works for you. Try tyrannizing yourself and see how successful you are. Power's not the game. Okay, what's the game? What's the story? I mentioned earlier, it's voluntary self-sacrifice. Right, you offer yourself up in the service of something higher. That's the basis of society. That's the basis of psychological stability. The Christian insistence is that that's the basis of the world.
I'm going to ask you again because I want to be clear. Is what is the God you believe in?
I think that the claim that Christ is the embodiment of the prophet and the laws, I think that's true.
Okay.
Yeah. But
So,
that's complicated. It's very, very complicated. But I think it's true.
so you believe that Jesus was
God?
God?
Yeah. I think if you understand what that means, that it's indisputable. I'll give you a brief explanation of why. Christ takes the sins of the world onto himself. So that means all the problems that there are his problems. Right. Okay, so the idea there is that there's no difference between making that assumption and then actually beginning to address those problems. And there's no difference between that which best addresses the problems of mankind and the divine. Those are the same thing. And I can't see how that can be otherwise, because the contrary hypothesis would be that you would adapt best to your life by avoiding things that are difficult and terrifying. And no one believes that. And so the pattern of the passion, this is the voluntary self-sacrifice issue taken to its extreme. The pattern of the passion is the decision to voluntarily confront and welcome anything that happens to you, no matter what it is. And that's a terrible thing to ask or endeavor to undertake. But, well, the alternative is to shrink away. Well, the spirit of shrinking away is the divine. It's like, I don't think so. Like that's preposterous. The spirit of unlimited courage? Well, that's not a bad start for a definition of what constitutes the divine. The highest possible value.
I want to briefly finish this with a critical question. What is the story? What is the best story? In the first chapter of John, the apostle writes that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. The word here is translated from the Greek logos, which means creative reason, logic, or intelligibility. We observe this intelligibility throughout the universe. It can also be translated as story. God is the story. Christ is the story. The story of Christianity is, as Peterson says here, voluntary self-sacrifice. You offer yourself up in the service of something higher. It's the basis of society and of psychological stability. The Christian insistence is that this is the basis of the world. Christianity is making a resurgence in our modern world because people are realizing that it's the best story. It's a true story. It's the story worth speaking up for, worth working for, and ultimately worth dying for, giving up your life for. We've come to realize that all of these other philosophies don't hold up. They fall apart. They don't last. Bad logos, bad logic, bad stories. We've come to realize, and I say thanks to people like Jordan Peterson, that it really is the way and the truth that leads us all to life in full.